So first, what is shifting left? I think it's a phrase, at least in this circle, that is fairly well understood. But I also have to explain what I do to my parents still, and they're like, shifting left. What does this mean? And what's security? I hear about breaches. Now we hear about the Equifax thing. I heard something else. What's going on? What do we do? So shifting left is very simply like, how do we bring security testing or testing in general and looking for defects earlier on in the development lifecycle? And the analogy I've used is, look, if I'm writing a novel like War and Peace, wouldn't I rather do spell checking and grammatical checking while I'm writing each chapter instead of waiting till I have the whole novel done and then having to go back and proofread it and check for errors and do that? I mean, that's the gate kind of like security exists today. And we want to remove that and make it as seamless and streamlined as possible. So that's really, what we talk about shifting left is like, okay, let's bring security, which has arguably always been to the far right of the process and kind of an outsider or gate. How do we bring them in and once again create this culture of DevSecOps, which is why we're here at DevSecCon, and really make collaboration key and have security have more of an engineering-centric mindset and have developers start building awareness of the SQL injection attacks, kind of the OWASP top 10. Like, arguably, developers haven't gotten that much better about writing secure code, or we still see the same vulnerabilities. How do we start like measuring that, to use a DevOps core tenet term, and improving upon that versus beating people up or pointing fingers, which is once again that cultural chasm. So I don't like to put a bunch of statistics in because we can all find different charts and different numbers, but the benefits of early testing by shifting left is pretty well publicized. And here's one from a study from IBM that really talks about the relative costs. So if I think about building in security assurance at the design phase and implementation, and I forgot the previous speaker talking about architecture and thinking about architectural design with respect to security, like you gain a lot of benefit from that. At the implementation side, it's still relatively low cost. Testing, you have some pain and some cost, but once you're into production and maintenance, getting security fixes and product defects to get prioritized over delivering new features is really difficult. And I think that, going back to what I said about inertia, is really the problem we have in general with a lot of systems, whether they're quote unquote legacy or greenfield. It's still not, security is important but not a priority. It's an unfortunate soundbite I've heard a lot from CIOs recently. I'm sure that conversation is probably shifting rapidly given the massive breach that just happened, but it still needs to be somewhere in the middle. I don't think it has to be the one and only priority, but it has to be thought of early and often. And like I said, like the same approach to this shift left testing versus QA and product defects really needs to be taken, needed for security and taken into account. So, going through this eye chart, it's really like, look what DevOps did for making development and operations much more seamless. And there was a talk about like the 10 top poster childs from Caroline's talk earlier this morning. Like at Netflix, we were deploying updates 400 to 1,000 times a day. So there's this continuous delivery model, and security needs to be part of that instead of the after the fact, because then you are always chasing. And so you're always behind, and then you have a very contentious conversation, going back to culture again, between security and development. Like security is like, you need to remediate this. Like, no, I need to get this feature out because we promised a customer or our consumers want it. So we need to bring the two together and shift security left as far left as possible as part of our core thesis, and make it part of that feedback loop as well. And I'll continue on. I'm a big fan of Patrick Lencioni's work with things like the 5 dysfunctions of a team and the advantage. And he talks about creating clarity, communicating clarity, and over-communicating clarity. So I'm going to over-communicate the culture part of this. And that culture is definitely the main barrier to change. And I think the the meme there is because that's the way we've always done things, and that is the fastest route for your company to become an incumbent or have a major security breach or get disrupted by a new innovative company, whether you think about Blockbuster and Netflix, you think about what Amazon is doing to literally every part of the industries, whether it's the food industry, shipping, e-commerce, etc. So you really have to think about what do we need to do culturally to adopt new technology and keep continually evolving. And the big cultural challenge between DevOps and SecOps of old is, the phrase "mind the gap," which I think Francois will probably resonate with him most. Is like, how do we close that chasm between the two and get them communicating, which is the cultural barrier once again. And we also talk a lot in the industry about the well-known cybersecurity talent shortage, and we can't keep trying to scale out human capital. So how do we do that? How do we buffer that and make up for that severe talent shortage and all these manual approaches? And I think our core thesis again is automation and orchestration, where automation handles the vertically focused tasks, and orchestration takes the processes across those tasks and correlates it. So if you think about the SDLC from code commit to application delivery, how do we bring security testing into that instead of these one-off processes where we say like, okay, on Tuesday, Nancy will run our static code analysis tool, and every other Saturday night at 2 a.m., Bob will run some dynamic pen testing tool. But neither of those results are typically not correlated, and they're always behind. So how do we get that into that DevOps CI/CD pipeline and get that closed feedback model? And so the collaboration and the cultural change that I talk about really starts with why. And like I said, there's this well-known, we love, and the press also love to talk about the shortage of cyber talent, but we don't like to talk, or we don't seem to like to talk about what are the solutions to that. And then adding to that is the security tool sprawl. For those of you that go to the RSA conference, for example, and you walk the floor, I mean, there's literally thousands of different tools, kind of all have the same description, whether they do the same thing or not. And they're really taking very vertically focused, kind of myopic views approach to this without the correlation and this comprehensive visibility, which I talk about in the lack of visibility. And then layering on this is the changing regulations, where on a minor front, you have the updated PCI, the payment cards. If you're processing credit cards, you used to have to do a pen test scan once a year. Now it's twice. But if you think about hackers are attacking your billing and payment system continuously, does that really move the needle? Like at Netflix, I was responsible for roughly 50 million credit cards, and we had to do the PCI scan once a year. So we get the big report. I'd go have a contentious conversation with development. They would get upset. They say, we already remediated this. I put some mitigating controls into place. We compromise. I talk to the QSA. And a month goes by. I write a large check to get the certification. We get it all done and wrapped up. I talk to the board. Meanwhile, the developers are making, like I said before, hundreds of changes per day. So now I've signed off on this, my neck is on the line, the company's neck is on the line, and we can make a change that makes us vulnerable, and it's good for a year. Like that is, I mean, to me, that seems severely broken, and I think we need to change some regulations. Last March, there were some new financial regulations that went into effect in the state of New York, that any significant change, if your assets were above a certain amount, I think it was 10 billion, that you had to do a scan or a pen test. But there's no one really monitoring that. And there's no solution on this. This is kind of an arbitrary mandate. And now with the forthcoming GDPR, so the General Data Protection Regulations going into effect in the EU, I believe it's next May. There's a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt around that. Like, okay, now, how do we manage our data? Do we give consumers more control over it? How do we put this hard perimeter around what is now a perimeterless world? So I think the regulations are not helping this. And then, last but not least, security, once again, especially after last week, is definitely going to be a board level or CEO level conversation. And how do you go present what our true risk posture is to them in terms that are that they can understand and relate to the business and how it affects the business without scaring them, or without lying to them and saying everything's fine, we have all this in place because we have a next-gen firewall, for example. Like, we have to have a common strategic framework to build upon and be able to communicate that, which is back to the collaborative culture. And security needs to be involved early and be implicit in the development lifecycle. And like I don't think I can emphasize that enough. Like, security is important and not a priority. It should be both, and companies need to be accountable for this. So like I mentioned, it's really about how do we step back and outline a strategic framework. And I think some of the ways I think about it, you can't secure what you don't know about. So you really have to take a comprehensive inventory. And given today's kind of cloud-first, ephemeral nature, that inventory is always going to be changing. But you have to take some, you have to get some point-in-time copy of where your code repositories are. I met with a CIO of a large firm recently, and he's like, look, we have developers using GitHub, we have Perforce, we have some other on-prem one, and I think we have some others that I don't know about. Like, I don't even know where my code lives. So if you don't know where your code repositories live, you certainly can't start doing static code analysis or source code composition analysis. And then often, unless you're in this kind of DevOps first, cloud first model, you don't have one build system. You may have CloudBees or Jenkins, you may have some old put together pipeline, you may still use common make files and to cobble this together with an old school sysadmin. But you really have to get a handle on what that is, and then figure out like what's the current state and what's the future state. And you really want to be able to converge those build systems over time onto one, and so you have that one barrier or gate to deploy where you can provide the security assurance. And then with what I call shadow cloud, you have different application deployments. Once again, I talked to a customer. They have production applications or consumer-facing applications in 3 public cloud providers, 2 colos, and then an on-prem environment as well. So like, think about the expansive nature of that, and then you have different developers, different build systems, different code repositories, and now different deployments. That is a really hard perimeter to secure or just get a hold of. So then it's, okay, once we have that assessment, what do we do with it? So now I've measured it, how do I measure improvement, and what is the goal, and get everybody in alignment with that, which requires collaboration versus the contentious security team yelling at the development team or infrastructure teams or vice versa, and nothing getting done. And then once you have a handle on that and some sort of automated process, how do you start performing your initial security tests? And ideally, you want to start at the far left with static code analysis and source code composition, kind of in the middle at the artifact build with open source and third-party library scanning. And then at the far right, doing dynamic pen testing and AppSec, looking for the OWASP top 10 and other common vulnerabilities. And once you have that baseline, how do you do that continuously? So you're in sync with every deployment that's significant, or even every deployment. How do we make sure we run the same battery of tests that is the same? Like, if you rely on humans to do this continuously, you will run into human configuration error. Like, I could be running a test and my wife calls me and says, look, you have to pick up your son from soccer. And so I stop the test, I'll figure I'll pick it up later. I either don't or I skip a step. We're just always prone to human configuration error. No matter how smart anyone is, we all make mistakes. But if we can automate that and do it continuously and measure it, it will move the needle significantly. And this goes to what I talk about, automated testing and feedback loops. So now you want to run this from, think about the entire SDLC. So now you run the test at code commit, build, delivery, and you have a feedback loop, and there's this virtuous cycle of the correlated results versus, like I mentioned before, one person does the test here at this time, another person does the test here at this time, but they never talk to each other. They're probably talking to different developers, and they're not also driving developer awareness which goes back to the collaborative culture that we're trying to build with the notion of DevSecOps. And you have to measure what is important. I think there's a lot of metrics in every area that we can measure that don't really matter to the business. Like you have to have a business first or revenue first mindset. And in security, a couple things we think about are what we call internal rate of detection. So how soon or how quickly in the SDLC can we find a defect? And then what's our internal rate of remediation? So how quickly can we remediate that? And if we don't, we at least have time boxed our level of exposure. So typically with a breach, you're like, well, I think it happened late last year, early this year, and now we know what happened here. If you keep track of this and measure it properly, you can definitively say, look, this vulnerability was exposed to production at this deployment, and it was remediated to this one. So you now know exactly the point in time where anything could happen, and if you have proper logging and other metrics, you can go back and more definitively say what happened and what the potential exposure or risk to the company is. And that visibility really should improve your overall resiliency. Where resiliency is how quickly can you bounce back from an adverse event. If you think about what Netflix has done with Chaos Monkey and Security Monkey, they're constantly attacking their own infrastructure to make it more resilient, so looking for those weak points. And hackers are certainly doing this. I mean, whether they're sophisticated black hats or script kiddies, they're all using the same tools. And unfortunately for us, they only have to get this right once, and we have to be right all of the time. So, and being right all the time is not going to happen if we're taking a periodic approach. So we really have to, as an industry or as a community of DevSecOps, we have to take a continuous approach. And we also want to start, talking about measuring what matters, let's start measuring improvement. And over time, hopefully we can start building developer awareness. If we can provide better targeted remediation advice, hopefully they start learning and say, oh, I know I'm writing this input balance checker for this web form. I made this mistake last time. Now I won't make that same mistake again. And I don't think that's happening today because there isn't a great feedback loop. So we need to tighten that up, and that goes back to, once again, the collaborative culture.
Is there any data around metrics about that? For instance, do we have any data showing that introducing security into DevOps path is either increasing or decreasing our defects rate or increasing our intercept rate of defects?
There's a report called The State of the Software Supply Chain, and I cannot remember who published it, but I think there's some really good metrics in that report that talk about this. And as a company, over time, given our early startup stage, we hope to provide those metrics back to the community of what our customers are seeing. But check out The State of the Software Supply Chain. I think there's some good validation in that. So I've talked a lot about the why and culture, and I'll go into a little bit about the how. And what we talk about is, you can't do everything all at once. I don't have a strategic framework in place. Where do I start? You can start at any point of the SDLC you want. I think an easy place to do is start right and then shift left over time. More and more companies and security engineers are familiar with dynamic pen testing or AppSec testing. And that's at the far right. So start there and get that baseline of your application, and then bring that in to maybe start then at whatever build system you're using, whether it's Jenkins, Travis, name your favorite CI tool. How do I look for open source and third-party library vulnerabilities at that stage, and start correlating that with the pen testing. And then as you get sophisticated around that and a good workflow, go to the further left. And at code commit, now I can run a scan depending on the language, and I can give developers more immediate feedback. So literally anytime a commit happens to a repo, you can run a tool and give them targeted remediation advice. So they get interrupted, but those interrupts are hopefully quick. Hopefully they're learning from them, and they have less to remediate versus, like I talked about, the yearly PCI audit, where you have literally a 50-page PDF report of a litany of issues to remediate. which is not a fun conversation to have. And that, once again, really the correlation and visibility, like visibility is, I think, always lacking in security. It's not like a lot of companies think about it. They think about like the little point in time testing they've done versus the comprehensive visibility of the lineage of an application or a suite of applications. And as you shift left, hopefully that increases collaboration between SecOps and DevOps and brings this concept or culture of DevSecOps to reality. And that DevSecOps is the new DevOps, and we don't ever talk about just DevOps again. Security is always part of that. And so the what? So this is getting to the culture of DevSecOps is a continuous journey. It's not a destination. You can never say, okay, we did this, we're done. You can always be improving. You can always figure out like better ways to test, how to extract the signal from the noise better of the different tools, how to get tighter feedback loops. You learn what is important to measure and why, and present that in a good dashboard that if you're the CIO or CISO, you can go to the CEO and board and much more confidently report, like, here's our true security and risk posture and how resilient we are, and where we are on the risk profile if something does happen and the impact to the business. And it's really about delivering continuous security assurance. I think if you look at cyber insurance premiums versus what gets paid out during a breach, I'm personally not a fan of insurance in general, but I don't think cyber insurance ever really covers the reputational hit, let alone the financial hit of a major breach. And it really has to be this methodology overlay into the entire CI/CD pipeline. Like, you can't think about it as, okay, I'm going to use this tool here, this tool here. It really has to be an implicit overlay or underlay, depending on your view of the world, or as we call sometimes a fabric. But you have to not impede development and velocity, but you have to be extremely additive to the security testing. And so, like I said, I really wanted to make this, more of a Q&A session about what challenges people are having, what's working, what's not working, like, how do you think about starting, how are the conversations gone if you've embarked on this DevSecOps journey, et cetera.
So in terms of integrating this into your pipeline and into your agile development processes, what methods have you seen teams use to deal with the influx of security work and whatever information comes back from these DevSecOps tools?
Great question. I think the first thing you have to do when you do what I talk about the initial inventory is a lot of these tools are really chatty, and especially like the open source stuff, there's no bounds on it. So you can't just take that and give it to development and expect them to extract that signal from the noise. So you have to invest some time up front to figure out like what is a true vulnerability and prioritize them, and kind of game the system a little bit by giving them like better targeted remediation advice to get them used to the process. But I think that's like the initial investment that needs to happen. Because if you just give them this big PDF or text report, that's not going to move the needle. It's not going to start you on this journey.
I've got one. There's always been a problem with all the different tools, which is like how much of a false positive, and most of the tools have been actually evaluated on the low number of false positives that we've got. But from a security point of view, what we're actually seeing now is false positive action a good thing, because that helps you to understand what is the anomaly that you're catching as part of a standard checklist. How do you see this being integrated in the future into some kind of tooling to help DevSecOps?
So the approach we've taken is really writing this normalization layer. So each tool finds different vulnerabilities or presents them a different way. So how do you take the strongest signal from that and normalize that and present a common output? And trying to like hopefully come up with a standard. I think Kevin mentioned that this morning, that Microsoft's working on this. But I think that's what needs to happen. Like you can't just say, and now we can start comparing different tools and figure out in your environment, given your language or your deployment, which one finds better results, or maybe the combination of these two work really well. So there's some A/B testing that goes into this also, which, hopefully the A/B testing once again creates more collaboration and gets people talking and getting input, and that development feels like they're part of this decision process as well, and they say, look, tool X is working better for us than tool Y, and I feel like overall we have better security assurance.
How do you reconcile in different inventory with a microservice model where you have thousands of services and you want to integrate?
Good question. So immutable infrastructure, the move to microservices, containerized environment. I think the way to start it in inventory is do one deployment of that and take a snapshot, and that should give you a good baseline. And then as that changes, you want to monitor those changes. And if there's extreme anomalies, like, oh, okay, typically I have n hundred containers running in this environment, and now I have 2x or 3x that, there's something strange. I should go look at that. And I think that goes back to visibility. So some CIOs, as they're moving applications from on-prem to cloud, they like, oh, I think I had whatever, how many bare metal servers? I think I have 40 EC2 instances in Amazon. Turns out they have 400. So outside of the potential cost implications of that, like the likelihood of human configuration error messing up a security group, for example, is pretty high. And so you can't secure what you don't know about. And if you have 10x the instances that you think, so then it's like, okay, how do I have a workflow engine around my microservice architecture, and how do I deploy to that? And making sure that I have some checks and balances in that without slowing it down.
So that question goes back to the teams. And part of the whole principle of DevOps is teams taking ownership of their pipeline. Does that mean that they also have to take ownership of the security tools going into the pipeline? If so, how do you handle that?
So I think that's what I described as the overlay, that security teams need to be overlaid into all of these build pipelines. So if you have different application deployments, security needs to be involved in all of those, but you can't put the onus on those existing teams. They're not going to care about security. So you have to have the right overall security infrastructure team to handle that and be able to and have enough to scale out with leveraging automation and orchestration.
So how would you suggest that a DevOps team essentially performs security testing of microservices before they deploy them? In the scenario that you can't scale the security team or do operational inventories?
So without giving too much of a vendor pitch, so the platform we've architected, if you're in Amazon, as part of the pipeline, before you do a production deployment, we replicate your VPC in Amazon speak and spin up the application and deliver updates to that and aggressively scan against that ephemeral clone. So now if we're successful with a SQL injection attack and corrupt your database, it doesn't matter because it wasn't production. So like that's, like if you think about the old days of waterfall in a QA environment, this is the DevSecOps version of that, just automated and orchestrated as part of the pipeline.
I'm curious about the ops side. You've talked about bringing security to the developers. Do we also bring them more to the SecOps side as well once they're on production?
So I think that goes back to what I talked a little bit about measuring, and I think your SOC or SecOps needs to understand what you're measuring and why, and be part of that. So loosely coupled, but still more deeply involved into the deployment process and the SDLC. But really, like we also talk about, okay, the SOC or SecOps team are just have alert fatigue and are flooded. We don't want to add on to that. We want to give them a comprehensive dashboard or graphs of actionable metrics.
Can you give me an estimate as to what percentage of the tests for your continuous test suites are chosen from your base set versus how much you predict will need to be bespoke for each of your applications or customers?
I'm of the opinion like it shouldn't be bespoke. Like I don't think anybody is that special. Their application is composed of very similar open source components. Like even a unique company like Netflix, they publish what they use. Like I don't think any environment is that special that they need a different methodology or overall pipeline. And I think going back to what I said about A/B testing, you figure out which open source or commercial tools work the best for you. But like there's well-known architectures, there's well-known tools, there's well-known frameworks. Everybody kind of packages them differently, but that doesn't require different testing. Like the testing methodology can be the same. So I always love to call on somebody when they don't answer a question, but like, I'll just ask a general question in closing. Devs, everybody's here because it's DevSecCon, so and presumably everybody believes that this notion of DevSecOps culture is important. Do you feel in your respective companies like that's becoming more prevalent, or people still, it's early days for the notion of DevSecOps? Like to me, it feels like it's gaining momentum and it's being talked about more, but there's still a lot of work, and thanks to Francois and his team, like I think conferences like this really build awareness.
Sorry. I think it's the culture shifting, but I don't think the cultural leadership may not be shifting as fast. So I think your developers really do understand it and are really trying their best. But prioritization, the whole who actually gets tooled and what happens after that may not be there yet. So.
No, it always has to come from the top down, whether it's CIO, CTO, CISO, like they really have to drive that culture change and talk about why, and I feel like there's the challenge we have in general.
The question, we're also a vendor similarly in the space, and we coach and coax our customers to audit and then educate the developers before enforcing them. So I feel like we're at the very early stage of that process.
You put the carrot before the stick?
Some financials will obviously not put anything in place and enforce right out of the box, but for the most part, it's more about the education side first. But just alerting them and giving them that type of information and feedback is a great start.
And I think that's a good point. I think one thing I've noticed in trying to do, we've gotten the response of okay, we're not ready yet. Which, if I'm selling or not, it doesn't really make sense to me. Okay, you're not ready for security. Okay, when are you going to be ready for security? When's it going to become important? After you have a breach and you're in the news and perhaps you've lost your job? Is that when it's important? So I don't want to over-index that with fear, uncertainty, and doubt and scare people, but it has to be part of the new reality. And I think the attack vectors now with IoT, it's increasing at a high velocity. So we have to change what we're doing, and going back to my regulatory rant, we need some UL equivalent around IoT.
I would say, from my experience, you can't do the DevSecOps unless you've got the DevOps completely nailed. From the numbers this morning, in the talk there was still there's only 27% of people are even doing the DevOps. I think that's people are conscious of the need for DevSecOps, but I don't think many are in the position where they can start rolling it in confidently.
I've actually thought about that a lot lately, talking to some firms that are still in waterfall or agile. I actually think it's probably easier to bring DevSecOps culture in before there's a DevOps culture. I think there's some contention that happens. Okay, we've already done this, why do we need security? Whereas if you bring it in as one full package, it might be easier, depending, once again, on the leadership. But I don't think you need to have adopted DevOps methodology or a full agile framework to do this. Let's start doing security testing early on, irrespective of the methodology and culture. Let's start ingraining it quickly or early.
Just a question, you have a QA team. It seems like quality assurance and security assurance kind of go hand in hand. Or for DevOps teams, or they already assume that they're doing the quality assurance? Is that already baked into that?
I think they should be done at the same time. If you think about security assurance and QA assurance, the way you test is the same. You're using different tools, but the framework is the same. So have that collaborate and measure both of those. but do it at the same time. I think you can parallelize this. It doesn't have to be gates.
Just one personal experience. So I don't only run conferences, I also do contracting as security architecture. And one of the biggest issues that I've got, that I faced, is companies telling you, yeah, this is fair, this is really good. We can do that in about 18 months because we're not ready yet. And that's maybe your answer. Just, okay, you should have been ready yesterday. The other problem that we face most of the time is just, are you trying to automate security out of a job? Yes, that can happen. But I think there is a better place for security folks to spend rather than looking at a single pane of glass displaying alerts, which you end up in alert fatigue. So there is still some education to do on companies of what DevSecOps is and how it can actually resolve security problems, not just for security, but for the overall business.
Absolutely, and I think no offense to any ethical hacker or pen tester, but like you can actually, through automation orchestration, you can actually become much more efficient. So now you can parallelize your scripts or however you do the pen testing and aggregate those results. And then that gives you more time to focus on higher order things like increasing the resiliency of your consumer or customer facing application. Like that's the goal. It's not, look, what I do is special and no one else can do this. Like making them more efficient is the message I would give and I do give in that.
So how I try to explain it to them was like sustainable architecture. And again, no offense to pen testers, I was there as well. And comparing pen testers and fertilizer. It is really good, it works on this instance, 6 months later you can't use the soil anymore. And I think we've seen that in most of the tooling, which are, okay, so we've got this report, we've got this PDF, which you can't copy or automate or use it. And that's one of the problems that we've got, just changing the industry to be a bit more agile and incorporating security part of their processes.
I mean, literally, during my whole career, every job I've ever had, that role was going away. Like, I started off as a Unix sysadmin back in the bare metal, Big Sun, Spark server days, and Unix sysadmins were always going away. No, you just had to continue to evolve and take some programmatic skills as infrastructure scaled out. And now, as you move to cloud, you just had to become, you had to know how to program cloud infrastructure and manage, servers and instances you can't touch. And you go on like CIO role is going away. No, you have to continue to evolve and become both technical and business-like. So like you like if you stay stagnant in your role, irrespective of what you're doing, your job will go away because you will get left behind. The world's moving faster and faster, and you have to keep pace with that change. And I think that's really what DevSecOps is about. Like, let's not leave security, falling further and further behind. Let's allow it to catch up and keep pace. Well, thanks everyone. I don't think anybody fell asleep, so mission accomplished.